Welcome back to the Humble Healer podcast, episode 46 today. And thank you for tuning in for this episode with Dr. Quang Lei, family physician. Today, we are talking about an important topic, opioid use disorder. And we'll start with the history of how this came about in America. And sadly, this is a uniquely American epidemic due to unique factors in our healthcare system and our culture and geographical location and so on. We'll talk more about that. But it does have an interesting history documented in Netflix and books, but we'll make it short, easy for you to follow. And then in the future episodes, we'll talk about symptoms and what to watch for. And then after that, treatment. So it will be a long series, but we'll tackle one episode at a time. And hopefully you'll learn something useful about this disorder and perhaps allow you to help patients and family members and yourself and so on. I've been practicing opioid use disorders treatment for the past 10 years and was one of the first to certify for buprenorphine and Suboxone treatment when it was an X category on the FDA number, and have seen and witnessed the damages that this have on the individual level and also society level and community level in so many different ways, and how one person's struggle with addiction can have a ripple effect on family members and the communities, and the cumulative effect is enormous in cost in so many different ways. So we'll talk about the history first in this intro episode on opioid use disorder, and a majority of the American families are affected directly or indirectly by this epidemic that has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans so far and affected millions of Americans and their family and community due to addiction and associated mental health disorders. And to call this opiate crisis an epidemic is not a hyperbole. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, put it in precisely those terms. Overdose death, especially those from prescription drugs and heroin, had reached epidemic levels. And what's fascinating about this health crisis is that this is uniquely an American one due to the unique American attitude toward healthcare, addiction, poverty, the media, crime, law enforcement, large corporations, and scientific research have all contributed to this nationwide crisis. Let's start with the history of morphine, which goes back a long way. When telling the history of opiate crisis and OxyContin, it's easy to forget that we're not talking about the last 40 years. Humans have loved opiates for thousands of years. The ancient Sumerians called the opium the joy plant, while it was also used in ancient Egypt and classical Greece, as well as India and the Arab Empire. The active molecule in opium is morphine. It's present in a number of other plants too, but not nearly in the same potency. Morphine was first successfully isolated in the early 1800s, and its use spread in the 19th century thanks to its properties as a painkiller. It was also put to use in many wars. The inventor of the hypodermic needle, Alexander Wood, believed his 19th century invention would reduce drug abuse, since users would be able to accurately measure the intake, something impossible through oral ingestion. Sadly, the story goes that Woodward became the first recorded victim of an intravenous opiate overdose. By the beginning of the 20th century, cost of such patent medicines had reached $75 million per year, and it was in this setting that Dr. Oder Wright synthesized the opioid heroin 1874 as part of an effort to find non-addictive alternative to morphine. Heroin, which is actually highly addictive, went on to be prescribed for everything from cough to menstrual cramps. Consequently, the rate of addiction exploded, and it happened because the doctors swore it was safe. There's some solid chemistry to explain why morphine is so addictive. The morphine molecule fits perfectly into the mu opioid receptors present in the brain in all mammals. These normally produce pleasure when they receive endorphins produced by the body, but when morphine is present, there's no need to wait for the endorphins. Now, we talked about in previous episodes how working to help with your wellness, such as working out in the gym, doing some meditation, having compassionate or kindness thought or gratitude can help produce dopamine and endorphins. But it comes in such a small dose, but it does help you feel that mild euphoric feeling. It feels good. And also when you give someone or do something nice or something good for someone. Now, in this case, you use chemicals to hijack that process. So when morphine enters the receptors, they are overwhelmed. The result is intense euphoria as well as numbing of pain and feelings more generally. However, the counterbalance to the euphoria is the brutal withdrawal symptoms that addicts face. These include insomnia and diarrhea on top of weeks of intense pain. In fact, withdrawal can be so overwhelming for some addicts that it pushes them to lie, steal, betray, and even to put their bodies at risk just to get their hands on a dose of the molecule. I have seen all these behavior in my patients that relapse, and it's unfortunate that that it changes their personalities and change how they are because of their intense physical and psychological pain and suffering that they have to endure during withdrawal. I've seen one of my patients on the street soliciting money, and it's very sad to see that. So the chemistry behind such problematic withdrawal is plain enough. While most drugs can be easily broken down into glucose in the body and then expelled, and other metabolites. Morphine is different. The morphine molecules stay intact and it lingers. How a tiny pill has a major role in the current opiate crisis. The opiate crisis is being felt all over the United States, but it didn't come out of nowhere. It was a slow process, the foundation of which was laid back in the early 1984. The drug company Purdue released a new product called MS Contin. MS stands for morphine sulfate. It was a time-release or extended-release morphine pill designed for treating pain in patients who were dying or who had just been released from surgery. And it was highly successful, so much so that the company released a similar drug in 1996. New drug had oxycodone as its active ingredient, and rather than MS content morphine, oxycodone is an opium derivative dissimilar to heroin. And once more, Purdue used its time-release coating formula. The name of this pill was OxyContin. OxyContin, remember that. The FDA approved OxyContin in 1995 as they believe Purdue's big claim about the pill. Supposedly, there's time-release coating would limit addiction by preventing the source of rapid highs and lows usually associated with opiates. And the consequences of this decision were very serious. Now Purdue could make OxyContin with a unique safety label that stated that the drug had less potential for abuse than other pain-killing drugs on the market. It was this claim that became the cornerstone of OxyContin's marketing, and this wonder drug would purportedly be the only painkiller a doctor would ever need to prescribe. It was to be an almost risk-free solution to chronic pain, unlike other opiates doctor had been prescribing for pain. This new drug had been shown to be addictive in less than 1% of patients, according to the study sent out by the pharmaceutical company. But there was a very specific reason these rates of addiction were so low, because MS Condom were being used in very carefully controlled hospital conditions. Conversely, OxyContin was marketed to doctors outside the hospital to be prescribed to the general public. And these doctors were used to dealing with chronic pain in their patients by prescribing opiates. Now, the old opiates were quite weak, their doses were small, and they contained agents such as acetaminophen or Tylenol to prevent abuse. OxyContin was different. It contained large doses of oxycodone and was only deemed safe because the special time release coating designed to supply the active ingredient over a long period. So Purdue soon began pushing in its new product. Its representative visited doctors several times a year and took them out to lavish lunches and attempting to drive home the merit of the time-release coating and how it ensured addiction was not an issue. And it did stop there. Mountains of OxyContin merchandise and medical seminars and luxurious resorts were quite the norm, and it was a success. Purdue sales tripled, and the bonuses for sales rose from $1 million in 1996 to $40 million in 2001. That's just the bonus for sales. By 2003, OxyContin was predominantly being prescribed by primary care doctors with very little pain management training. Purdue has successfully transformed the entire industry. Prescribing for pain had become the norm, not the exception. Contributing to the epidemic also about the concept of treating pain, which underwent a revolution in America in the 1980s. A doctor at Boston University of Medicine, Dr. Herschel Chick, was asked in the early 1960s to put together a database of the records of patients who've been hospitalized there. And in 1979, Chick became curious about what he could learn from this data, and he wanted to find out how many patients treated with narcotics while at the hospital had become addicted. And he discovered that of about 12,000 patients, only 4 out of 12,000, so less than 1% for sure. Dick wrote a short paragraph together with Jane Porter, a graduate student who'd been assisting him, in which they described their finding and sent to New England Journal of Medicine, where it was published under the latter sections. Elsewhere in the medical profession, at about the same time, the doctors were becoming increasingly interested in the idea of pain. For years, they'd had patients suffering from chronic pain coming to them and begging for help, and the implications seemed clear enough. Pain was a serious matter and it was being undertreated. Consequently, in 1996, the American Pain Society went so far as to declare that pain was the fifth vital sign. And it was in this context that advocates pushing for more treatment with opiates, such as the California's Board of Pharmacy, started putting out statements that make these bold assertions, such as studies show opiates have an extremely low potential for abuse when correctly used. Also, at the same time, doctors were fearful because they were told that patients' right meant that they were being sued if they didn't treat patients' pain, and that meant doling out opiates. And also, seemingly out of nowhere, people started citing Porter and Chick, that little paragraph that had been written years earlier about patients in Boston, and it was being cited by people that had actually read its few lines and who were treated as gospel science. Indeed, the science magazine Scientific American labeled it as extensive study in 1990, while 2001 Time Story casually referred to it as a landmark study. Just like that, a long-held wisdom about opiates were being thrown out of the window. If a patient asked for higher doses of other drugs, it was taken as an indicator that the treatment wasn't working. And with opiates, that meant that the dosage prescribed was simply too low. And a new term even cropped up, pseudo-addiction. It described the appearance of addiction that manifested in some patients, but in reality, all they wanted was a sufficient dose to end pain and the withdrawal. It was determined that these patients ought to have their dosage increased aggressively. The rise of pill mill across America. In Portsmouth, Ohio, once a bustling town built by and for American industry, when globalization hit hard, factories were closed and jobs disappeared. In the 1990s, by the 1990s, this town, like so many other cities in the American Rust Belt, was a shadow of its former self. But it was places like Portsmouth that a sinister industry emerged. The jobs were hard to come by, but Medicare cards were much easier to find. And this new economy was based on pill mills, clinics where doctors did little else other than write up prescriptions for opiates. The number of applicants for a disability program called Supplemental Security Income nearly doubled between 1998 and 2008 in Scioto County, Ohio, which includes Portsmouth. Many of these new applicants made regular visits to pill mills where they could stock up on OxyContin and trade these pills on the black market for whatever else they might need. Some even got entrepreneurial about it and sought out groups of addicts whom they would drive to the clinic. In exchange for the ride and for paying the clinic fee, the entrepreneur received half of the pills that were prescribed to the addicts. Before too long, an Oxy, a common street name for OxyContin pill, was worth $1 per milligram, and from just selling pills, it was possible to buy anything from TVs to laundry, detergents, and so on. Sub-economies also developed around the illegal market, since patients sometimes need to pass urine tests to get their prescriptions. So clean urine were also worth a pretty penny. Giles urine were at a particular premium, up to $40 a bottle. Many pill mills weren't actually opened by doctors, so their success depending on their less reputable source of medical practitioners. This is when so-called locum tenens lists were used. These were lists of doctors who were desperate and on the lookout for temporary employment. These are often because of license problems, substance abuse, or simply because they were unable to obtain malpractice insurance. A perfect ecosystem of abuse had been created, and it wasn't long before established drug dealers got in on the act. So that's the beginning of the history on this opioid use disorder series, and we'll continue more in the next episode about the history and also getting on more on the clinical symptoms and signs of patients with opioid use disorders and how to screen for that. Thank you for tuning in. And please leave me any comment and feedback. Subscribe to the channel and share with your family and friends. Take care and Happy New Year.